June 1940 Berlin. Inside a quiet conference room deep within the German High Command building, several senior officers studied intelligence reports about a country many of them barely considered a real military threat. The United States. At the head of the table stood a Luftwaffe officer pointing at a map of North America. Germany had just conquered France. Most of Europe was now under Nazi control. From the Atlantic coast to the Polish border, Hitler's armies appeared unstoppable. And many German commanders believed the future of the war had already been decided. The officer tapped the map again. "The Americans," he said calmly, "are industrially strong, but politically weak. Their people have no appetite for war." Several officers nodded. In their view, the United States was a distant nation across the Atlantic, divided by politics and protected by oceans. Even if America entered the war, German planners believed it would take years for the country to mobilize. Years Germany believed it simply would not need. But the truth was something no one in that room fully understood. While German armies marched across Europe, a quiet transformation was already beginning across the factories of the United States. President Franklin Roosevelt had already started preparing American industry for a war many still hoped could be avoided. Factories that once built refrigerators, cars, and radios were slowly being redesigned. Assembly lines were being expanded. Machine tools were being upgraded. And production schedules were being rewritten. At first the changes seemed small. A factory in Michigan increased aircraft component production. A steel plant in Pennsylvania doubled its output. Shipyards along the American coasts began experimenting with faster ways to construct cargo ships. To German intelligence officers watching from across the Atlantic, these changes looked insignificant. Their reports suggested American industry was large but inefficient. German analysts believed American factories were too dependent on consumer goods. They believed American workers lacked discipline. And they believed American democracy would prevent the country from mobilizing quickly. One German industrial expert summarized it bluntly. "The Americans build automobiles," he wrote. "We build weapons." The assumption would become one of the most expensive miscalculations of the entire war. Because American industry was about to demonstrate something the world had never seen before. Not simply large production, but production on a scale so massive that even German generals would later struggle to comprehend it. By late 1941, the first signs were already appearing. Aircraft factories expanded across the United States. New assembly lines stretched across enormous hangars. Entire cities of workers appeared almost overnight around new manufacturing plants. One of the most astonishing examples stood outside Detroit. The Willow Run factory. Built in just 9 months, this gigantic facility would soon begin producing B-24 bombers using automotive-style assembly lines. Aircraft would move through the factory in stages, just like cars. German engineers later admitted they could barely understand how such a system worked. But for American industry, it was only the beginning. Soon dozens of factories across the country would begin producing aircraft at speeds that had once seemed impossible. Bombers, fighters, transports, training aircraft, engines, propellers, machine guns, each component produced in separate factories, then shipped across the country for final assembly. It was a system designed not just to build weapons, but to build them faster than any enemy could destroy them. German intelligence reports began to notice the change. But even then, many officers dismissed the numbers. Surely the Americans were exaggerating. Surely their factories could not truly produce weapons at the rates their reports claimed. The numbers seemed ridiculous. Thousands of aircraft. Tens of thousands. Eventually the estimates reached numbers so large that German officers simply stopped believing them. But the factories kept running. Day and night. Across the United States, the machines never stopped. And slowly, quietly, America was becoming something the German High Command had never expected to face. The greatest industrial war machine the world had ever seen. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack on the American Pacific Fleet changed everything. Within hours, the United States was officially at war. Across Washington, military planners began activating production plans that had been quietly prepared for months. Factories that once produced civilian goods were suddenly transformed into war industries. Automobile companies stopped making cars. Instead, their assembly lines began producing tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines. The scale of the transformation stunned even American officials. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, companies that once competed to sell automobiles, were now working together to build the machines of war. Entire industrial regions were reorganized. Steel mills increased output beyond anything seen during peacetime. Rubber factories expanded to supply tires for millions of military vehicles. Oil refineries increased production to fuel the growing American war machine. And everywhere, factories needed workers. Millions of American men had joined the military. To replace them, millions of women entered the workforce. Soon the image of Rosie the Riveter became one of the symbols of American wartime production. Women who had never worked in heavy industry now operated welding torches, machine tools, and assembly equipment. Shipyards expanded along both coasts. New docks and cranes appeared almost overnight. Cargo ships began leaving American ports carrying enormous quantities of weapons and supplies. The speed of ship construction became legendary. The Liberty ship, a cargo vessel designed specifically for mass production. At the beginning of the war, building a ship often took several months. American engineers reduced that time dramatically. Eventually, a Liberty ship could be assembled in just days. German submarine commanders operating in the Atlantic soon noticed the results. Every time they sank Allied cargo ships, more ships appeared. Sometimes even faster than they could destroy them. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, later admitted the reality. The Germans were sinking ships. But the Americans were building them even faster. Meanwhile, aircraft factories expanded at a pace that shocked German intelligence. Factories in California, Michigan, Texas, and Washington began producing fighters and bombers in enormous numbers. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Each aircraft required thousands of components. Yet American factories built them using assembly line methods perfected in the automobile industry. Parts arrived from hundreds of subcontractors across the country. Engines from one state, wings from another, electronic equipment from another. These parts converged at giant assembly plants where final aircraft were completed. One factory alone, Willow Run, eventually produced a new bomber every hour. German intelligence officers studying these numbers struggled to understand them. In Germany, building a bomber required enormous time and resources. Factories were constantly disrupted by Allied bombing. Production slowed by shortages of aluminum, fuel, and skilled workers. American factories faced none of these problems. The United States mainland remained completely untouched by war. No bombers appeared above its cities. No artillery shells struck its factories. And its supply of raw materials seemed endless. Iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, oil from Texas, rubber from overseas colonies, food from vast American farms. Everything required for industrial production existed within the reach of American industry. The result was an explosion of production. By 1943, American factories were producing weapons at a pace that shocked the world. Hundreds of tanks every month, thousands of aircraft, millions of rifles and machine guns, billions of rounds of ammunition. The United States had become something far more dangerous than German planners had imagined. Not just another enemy, but an industrial superpower capable of overwhelming its opponents with sheer production. And the numbers were only beginning to rise. By 1943, the true scale of American production was becoming impossible to ignore. German intelligence officers gathered reports from across Europe and the Atlantic. Pilots returning from combat missions described endless streams of Allied aircraft. Submarine commanders reported cargo convoys so large they seemed impossible to destroy. And soldiers on the eastern and western fronts began encountering American equipment everywhere. The reports all pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. American industry was producing weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. One German officer studying captured equipment summarized the situation in a single sentence. "The Americans do not fight the war with weapons," he wrote. "They fight it with factories." Nowhere was this more visible than in the skies above Europe. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had dominated the air. German fighters were faster, their pilots more experienced. But by 1943 the situation had begun to change. Massive formations of American bombers began appearing over occupied Europe. Hundreds of aircraft flying together in tight formations. B-17 flying fortresses. B-24 Liberators. Each one heavily armed with machine guns. Each one built in factories thousands of kilometers away. German fighter pilots were shocked by the size of the formations. Intercepting one bomber had been manageable. Intercepting hundreds at once was something entirely different. Even when German fighters successfully destroyed bombers, more aircraft appeared in the next raid. German intelligence tried to calculate how many bombers the Americans possessed. The numbers seemed unbelievable. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. Factories in the United States were producing aircraft at speeds never before seen in history. In 1940, the United States had produced just a few thousand military aircraft. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 90,000 aircraft in a single year. The numbers overwhelmed German planners. Even if German fighters shot down hundreds of aircraft, the Americans could replace them within weeks. And the aircraft were not the only weapons arriving in massive numbers. American tanks rolled across battlefields in North Africa and Italy. Sherman tanks arrived in huge shipments. Hundreds at a time. Trucks carried supplies across deserts and mountains. Artillery guns fired shells produced in American factories. Even the food eaten by Allied soldiers often came from American farms. Canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, coffee. German soldiers encountering American supply dumps often stared in disbelief. One German officer captured in Italy later described what he saw inside an Allied warehouse. Crates of food stacked higher than a house. Rows of vehicles waiting for drivers. Boxes of ammunition stretching for hundreds of meters. He later wrote in his diary that the Americans seemed to possess endless resources. In Germany the situation was very different. By 1943 Allied bombing campaigns had begun striking German industrial centers. Factories in the Ruhr Valley were damaged repeatedly. Railroads were destroyed. Oil refineries burned. Production slowed as workers struggled to repair damaged plants. German engineers worked desperately to keep factories operating. But the pressure was constant. Meanwhile, American factories continued running without interruption. Night and day, 7 days a week. Assembly lines stretched across factory floors larger than entire city blocks. Workers produced aircraft wings, tank engines, and artillery shells in enormous quantities. The scale of the production shocked even Allied commanders. General Dwight Eisenhower later described the American industrial effort as one of the decisive factors of the entire war. It was not simply the bravery of soldiers that would defeat Germany. It was the ability to produce weapons faster than the enemy could replace them. German generals slowly began to understand this reality. But by the time they truly grasped the scale of American industry, the war had already begun turning against them. The factories across the United States had become the most powerful weapon of the Allied war effort. And they were only getting started. By 1944 the full power of American industry had reached the battlefields of Europe. Every Allied invasion, every major offensive, every supply convoy now depended heavily on equipment produced in American factories. German commanders studying the situation began to realize something alarming. The Allies were not simply matching German production. They were surpassing it by enormous margins. The numbers told the story clearly. American factories had already produced tens of thousands of aircraft, bombers, fighters, transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft. By the final year of the war, the United States alone would produce more than 300,000 aircraft. A number so large that even German intelligence officers struggled to comprehend it. Germany, despite its advanced engineering and skilled workforce, could not come close to matching that level of production. Allied bombing raids had damaged many of Germany's factories. Shortages of fuel and raw materials slowed production, and skilled workers were increasingly sent to the front lines as soldiers. Meanwhile, American industry expanded without interruption. Gigantic aircraft plants appeared across the country. Workers assembled planes on moving production lines. New aircraft rolled out of factories daily. Some factories produced hundreds of planes each month. The United States was not only building aircraft for its own forces. It was also supplying aircraft to its allies. British squadrons flew American-built bombers and fighters. Soviet pilots received thousands of aircraft through the Lend-Lease program. Across multiple continents, the influence of American industry was everywhere. German pilots noticed it first. In the early years of the war, German fighters had often faced small groups of enemy aircraft. But by 1944 they were encountering massive formations. Hundreds of bombers flying in tight defensive formations, escorted by long-range American fighters. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings. These aircraft escorted bombers deep into German territory, protecting them from interception. German fighter units tried to break through the escorting fighters to reach the bombers. But every battle cost them precious aircraft and experienced pilots. And every aircraft lost by Germany was difficult to replace. For the Americans, replacement aircraft arrived constantly. Trainloads of new fighters and bombers reached airbases across Europe. Pilots trained in the United States arrived with fresh aircraft ready for combat. The imbalance became clear even to German commanders. Every time the Luftwaffe destroyed a bomber formation, another appeared days later. Sometimes even larger. German pilots began describing the sky over Germany as filled with endless streams of Allied aircraft. One pilot later wrote that during some raids it felt as if the bombers never stopped coming. Destroying one aircraft meant little when dozens more followed behind. And behind those bombers stood something even more powerful. The American factories that continued building aircraft faster than any enemy could destroy them. The same pattern appeared on land and sea. Sherman tanks rolled across Europe in large numbers. American trucks transported soldiers and supplies across thousands of kilometers. Cargo ships crossed the Atlantic carrying weapons, fuel, and equipment. Every battlefield began to reflect the same reality. Germany was fighting not just an army, but an entire industrial system. A system capable of replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. German generals had once believed their superior weapons and tactics would guarantee victory. But the war was no longer decided by individual battles. It was decided by production. And in that contest, the United States had become unstoppable. By the final year of the war, even the most confident German commanders could see the reality forming around them. The war had changed. In the early years, Germany had relied on speed, surprise, and tactical brilliance. Blitzkrieg had allowed German forces to defeat larger armies across Europe. But Blitzkrieg had always depended on momentum. Once the war slowed down, industrial power began to matter more than battlefield tactics. And in industrial power, Germany faced an opponent unlike anything it had ever encountered. Across the Atlantic Ocean, American factories had become the engine of the Allied war effort. Day and night, assembly lines continued producing the machines of war. Workers welded aircraft frames. Machinists cut engine parts. Engineers improved production methods to make factories even more efficient. Entire cities had transformed into industrial centers dedicated to victory. Detroit produced tanks and vehicles. California built aircraft. Pennsylvania forged steel. Texas refined fuel. Every part of the country contributed to the massive production effort. And the results appeared everywhere on the battlefield. American trucks carried supplies across Europe in endless convoys. Artillery units fired shells produced by the millions. Aircraft filled the skies above the continent. The sheer volume of equipment began overwhelming German defenses. For German soldiers on the front lines, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Allied forces seemed to possess unlimited supplies. Whenever a German unit destroyed a group of enemy tanks, more tanks appeared. Whenever a bomber formation was shot down, another formation arrived days later. German officers tried to maintain morale by insisting that Allied losses were unsustainable. But many soldiers had already reached their own conclusions. They could see the endless convoys of vehicles. They could hear the constant roar of aircraft engines overhead. They could watch American artillery firing shells without concern for shortages. Germany simply could not match those numbers. German industry continued producing advanced weapons. The Panther tank, the Tiger tank, the V-2 rocket. But these weapons were complex and expensive. They required large amounts of time and resources to build. American industry followed a different philosophy. Instead of building a few extremely advanced machines, American factories built enormous quantities of reliable equipment. Thousands of trucks, thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of aircraft. Each machine designed to be produced quickly and replaced easily. The result was overwhelming. German generals began describing the situation using a new phrase. They said they were fighting the arsenal of democracy. It was not simply an army. It was the combined industrial power of an entire nation. Factories that never stopped. Resources that never seemed to run out. Workers who continued producing weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. By late 1944, the outcome of the war had become increasingly clear. Germany was no longer fighting a battle it could realistically win. Even if German soldiers fought bravely on the battlefield, they faced an enemy whose industrial strength seemed limitless. The factories across the United States continued working. And every week, every month, more weapons arrived in Europe. The numbers kept rising, and soon the scale of American production would reach a level that shocked even the most experienced German commanders. More than 300,000 aircraft built during the war, a number that would become one of the defining symbols of American industrial power. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its final stage. German cities were in ruins. Railways had been destroyed by months of bombing. Fuel shortages crippled the remaining German armored units. And the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in Europe, struggled to place enough aircraft in the sky to defend the homeland. Meanwhile, the Allied war machine continued advancing. American bombers filled the skies over Germany. Huge formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the borders day after day. Escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt, they struck factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and military bases across the collapsing Reich. German pilots still fought with courage. But they faced an impossible task. Every aircraft lost by Germany was difficult to replace. Every experienced pilot shot down represented years of training that could never be recovered. The Americans faced no such limitations. Behind every aircraft flying over Europe stood an enormous industrial network stretching across an entire continent. Factories continued producing new aircraft every day. Replacement parts arrived constantly. New pilots trained in American flight schools crossed the Atlantic with fresh squadrons of fighters and bombers. Even when the Luftwaffe managed to shoot down large numbers of Allied planes during a raid, the strategic situation barely changed. Because within weeks, new aircraft appeared to replace them. German commanders studying the situation began to understand the true scale of what they were facing. The United States had not simply joined the war. It had transformed the war. The numbers alone told the story. During World War II, American industry produced more than 300,000 military aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, training aircraft, engines, propellers. Entire fleets of aircraft produced at speeds no nation had ever achieved before. The figure stunned even Allied commanders. It meant that American factories were producing aircraft faster than the Axis powers could destroy them. But aircraft were only one part of the equation. American industry also produced tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks, thousands of ships, millions of rifles, billions of rounds of ammunition, and enormous quantities of fuel, food, and supplies. Every weapon required to fight a global war. By the final months of the conflict, German generals could see the truth clearly. They had underestimated the industrial strength of the United States. They had believed American democracy would slow mobilization. They had believed American factories would struggle to adapt to war production. Instead, American industry had become the most powerful weapon of the Allied war effort. After the war, Several German commanders openly admitted the reality. They had never truly understood what American industry was capable of. One German officer later summarized the experience in a simple sentence. "We prepared to fight the American army. What we actually fought was American production." In the end, the factories across the United States had done something unprecedented. They had created a flow of weapons so vast that it overwhelmed the Axis powers. The war had not been decided by a single battle. It had been decided by millions of machines rolling off assembly lines. Tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, weapons built by workers thousands of kilometers from the battlefield. The German generals who once dismissed American industry eventually learned the truth. It was not the size of an army that determined victory. It was the ability to supply that army. And in that contest, the United States had become the most powerful industrial force the world had ever seen. More than 300,000 aircraft, a number that still stands today as one of the greatest achievements of wartime production. Proof that in modern warfare, factories could be just as decisive as soldiers. The German generals had laughed at American industry. But by the end of the war, no one was laughing anymore.